Hi, and welcome to part two of our two-part webinar series on the Americans with Disabilities Act, supporting inclusion for employees. I'm Josh Taylor. I'm a research and training associate with the VCU Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on employer practices for individuals with disabilities. So let's jump right in and keep this short and sweet. So really the objectives that for this webcast are to define and to talk a little bit about what reasonable accommodations are and to know how to provide them. And then we'll also talk a little bit sort of connected with this is this idea of discussing disability or disclosure. And so we'll talk about some do's and don'ts for discussing and talking about disability with employees and coworkers in a workplace. So as a reminder, this is part two of a two-part series. In the first part, which I hope you caught, we talked about what the Americans with Disability Act was and how it protects employees with disabilities and identifying which employers the law affects. Well, we also talked about what the ADA requires and doesn't of employers who qualify under that. So we'll kind of be building off of that and talking more in depth about accommodations and talking about disability related to that. So just as a reminder, those requirements for employers, the ADA really sets out to prohibit discrimination kind of broadly. And so we talked about it doesn't just cover employment and workplaces. It really is a kind of a broad legislation that prohibits discrimination in many aspects of life. But for the purpose of this two-part series, we do focus on workplaces and employment. And it protects discrimination from the time of application, so even before an individual is an employee, to that employee leaving the company. So it's quite broad, in not only in the terms of the scope of the legislation itself, but also in terms of how it thinks about sort of who's protected in an employment setting. And this covers harassment, requires confidentiality of those records. And then, one of the bigger parts as far as how it impacts workplaces is the part that we'll focus on in this part of the webinar series, which is the requirement of reasonable accommodations. We'll talk a little bit about, what that reasonable qualifier, what that means in practice, as well as sort of thinking about what accommodations are more broadly and what they can look like. So before we get too into depth with it, I want to give just 4 basic facts about accommodations. And these are the really important ones. If you're talking to a colleague and they say, hey, what did you learn in that webcast about accommodations or about the ADA? These really are the 4 big things to know about accommodations in the workplace. The first is that most employees with disabilities don't require accommodations at all. It can be successful to companies and provide value to organizations without accommodations. So we're already talking about a smaller subset of employees with disabilities that even require those. That takes us to the second point is most of those accommodations that are needed by individuals are free. They can easily be provided with just basic modifications to existing resources and don't require any additional investment of funds. So we know that most individuals with disabilities don't require them. Most that they do need are free. Okay, great. The third is that the cost of the accommodations, if there is a cost attached to them, is usually minimal. So around $500 is the average for those accommodations that do have a cost attached to them. So we already know most individuals don't need them. Most of those are free, and those that do are average about $500. And the great bonus to this is that those accommodations that are put in place have been shown to lead to better productivity, not only for the individuals, but for the organizations themselves. So accommodations are great. I love talking about this topic. We'll try to keep it brief today, short and sweet and to the point. But the big takeaway here from these 4 points you can see is that these are very effective ways to increase productivity for a minimal investment. So before we get into kind of specifics of accommodations, let's back up a little bit. Remember we talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act requiring that reasonable accommodations. Let's talk a little bit about what that that qualifier reasonable is. So the ADA defines a reasonable accommodation as an adjustment or modification to a job or work environment that allows an individual with disability to either apply for a job, to perform those essential functions of a job, or to enjoy benefits equal to employees without disabilities. And so if you caught part one of this webcast, remember we talked about the essential functions of a job are really those core features that have to be done within the job. So, a job may have modifications, different individuals that are in the same role may approach that differently, but those core functions of a job are ones that are really, really essential to the person serving in that role. So the accommodations need to allow an individual with a disability to be able to perform those or apply for a job or to have benefits that are equal to that. But the other qualifier is that they can't provide or they don't need to provide an accommodation that would be an undue hardship to the organization. And we'll talk a little bit about this today, and then I'll point you towards resources that will give you a little bit more information if this is one that may apply to you. So when we talk about accommodations, we talk about the adaptations and modifications to a work environment. I want to start by just giving some examples that give a sense of how broad these may be, and these may make more sense in context with what we talked about earlier, as far as that most accommodations are free and those that aren't are very inexpensive. And so accommodations can cover anything from, as you see in the pictures here, sort of an adapted table or platform for an individual's office or workspace. You can say this one is kind of tall and wide enough to allow a wheelchair user to be able to fit under there, but also may be a useful functional workspace for other individuals as well. In the picture just below that, you can see a job coach working with an employee. For individuals that are engaged in supported and customized employment and receive services through the vocational rehabilitation agency in their community, job coaching is one of the supports that's often offered to help an individual learn those essential functions of a job, to find natural supports within that, and really to be successful at integrating into a role within a workplace. Above that, you can see some noise canceling headphones. So those can be obviously are a core part of many jobs and work environments that have a higher threshold of noise to protect hearing of employees. But some individuals that have different sensory differences related to their disability, may have a different threshold for what that sound and background noise sensitivity may be. And so that may be an accommodation that many other colleagues and employees may not require in an environment, but may be a helpful way to kind of increase productivity for those individuals that need it. And below that, you can see a woman using an adaptation that's built into the computer to magnify the text on our screen. So again, these are more examples of free accommodations that are often built into the software that we already use and the hardware that's used in many offices and workplaces, just to provide those accommodations. And so these can be really helpful for individuals with a range of disabilities, as well as those without disabilities, that can be helpful supports and modifications. And the last one is a picture of a clock with the word break on it, and building in those breaks for individuals that their disability may impact their the duration of periods that they can work, or breaks related to things like this can be really helpful as a way to increase productivity. And so again, the expectation is that overall these impact and increase in individuals' productivity to an organization. And so this website is an organization is a really great one. So they are the Job Accommodation Network has some fantastic resources that again, if you take one thing away from this this talk on accommodations, this is one to jot down and come back to later. Jan or the Job Accommodation Network have really fantastic resources. They have some tools to help kind of problem solve, explain how to fit accommodations in, make suggestions about what accommodations are reasonable and make sense in different environments for different individuals. And they have just a wonderful staff that can help problem solve beyond that. So in exploring accommodations for employees with disabilities, this is one I would very highly encourage you to check out and to take a look at some of their resources. And so now that we have an idea of some of the range of what accommodations can cover, and we really have a sense of like this can be many different types of adaptations and tools sometimes, but also just modifications to a workplace or work environment or work process. Let's talk a little bit about what that accommodation process looks like as set out by the ADA. So in this process, the first step is an employee requests an accommodation. So there's a little bit of flexibility in this, but the employee is the one that makes the initial request. That second bullet point under that is very important, though. This can be formally or informally. This doesn't have to be, filling out a form in triplicate and sending it off to, a certain office. This can be informally just by approaching a supervisor about an accommodation. So there's no requirement about sort of the way that this has to take place. This can be an informal process, but that request for an accommodation to be protected under the ADA at least must be linked to the medical condition. So it has to be something related to their disability in some way. Again, this can be quite broad. So an example might be, those noise canceling headphones we saw for an individual with autism working in, an office that's shared by many individuals, that it may help productivity, for that individual to be able to focus. And that's related to some of the sensory differences related to autism. So that would be an example of one where, the request is linked to something about their disability with the medical condition itself. And then the next step after that, so that sort of gets the process started, and that's sort of how it's initiated. And the next step is the cool part. That's where the employer and the employee work together to find a solution. And as I said before, that JAN website, that organization, they've got some great tools and resources that give examples of accommodations. They have different tools to help kind of problem solve and think about those. But really, this should be a collaborative process of thinking about, what makes sense. Accommodations, remember the goal is to increase productivity. So these shouldn't be adaptations and modifications that are, distracting or, take away from productivity. The idea is that these are resources that are going to boost productivity. And then the next step after that is just putting it into action. Certainly, since this is a collaborative process, this can be iterative. So, trying out one accommodation, revisiting it in a couple of weeks, seeing if it works, making modifications to that. These are all okay parts of the accommodation process. So, one of the things, that since in that previous slide, we talked about that accommodation has to be related to a person's disability. Sort of the implicit connotation with that is that we have to talk about disability then, right? In order to provide accommodations, in order to provide protections, we have to have some idea about a person's disability. But when approaching this, in order to protect an individual's privacy, there's definitely some do's and don'ts about how to talk about disability. So, as thinking about this from the employer perspective, some of the don'ts related to talking about disabilities that we don't want to ask about any impairment or disability. We don't want to ask questions that would prompt an individual to disclose their disability. So disclosure is when an individual shares information about their disability, and it's often to receive those accommodations or protections under the ADA. So we don't want to ask directly about the disability. We don't want to ask questions related to disclosure or that would prompt that. We don't want to ask questions about medication that could either talk about the medication or give a sense of a person's disability. And we don't want to ask about we shouldn't ask about previous workers' compensation claims. So those are sort of the 4 areas that are off limits. But what we can do is really refocus it. And if you saw part one of the two-part webcast series, remember that the ADA is really about shifting that mindset from the medical model of we're providing supports related to a person's impairment to we're trying to think about ways that we can create a more inclusive environment that reduces those barriers. So thinking about it from that perspective, the way that we want to talk about disability is to talk about what is required for the position. What is the education, the training, what are the skills that are required? And can the individual perform those essential functions? Our goal as employers and as businesses is to find individuals that can perform the functions that are going to lead to higher levels of productivity. So if we can find individuals that can address those essential functions, then we can figure out accommodations that build on that. So, in putting this all together, and thinking about the two parts of this webcast series, the Americans with Disabilities Act protects people with disabilities in the workplace by prohibiting discrimination very broadly, by requiring reasonable accommodations that we talked about in this part that can cover a range of modifications to the workplace or work process. It does prohibit retaliation. So if an individual were to take action based on their rights as specified by the ADA, it does protect retaliation from an organization, and it requires that confidentiality. And so that confidentiality is manifested in the way that we approach talking about disability in the workplace, as well as kind of more concretely in the way that their records are kept. So any information about medical conditions or disability are kept separate from personnel files. And then it requires the provision of accommodations that are reasonable, that are effective, that are not an undue hardship, and that are determined through that interactive process that we talked about, where an employee with a disability discloses and requests an accommodation that can be formally or informally. And then there's that, collaborative working together of the employer and the employee to find accommodations that work and make those modifications as needed. So, what this means in the big picture, as we talked about, the ADA encourages access and inclusion. So it's really thinking about that social model. How can we reduce barriers to include individuals with disabilities as contributors to an effective and productive workspace, more than it's about compliance? I think sometimes we think about sort of compliance related to the various legislation, but this is really about promoting access and inclusion. And it can provide a useful framework not only for providing accommodations and for protecting against discrimination, but really for using this as a framework to think about how, as organizations, we can increase the inclusion and productivity of all employees, including those with disabilities. So it can be a very useful way of just applying that lens of thinking about what are potential barriers for individuals and how to create a more universally designed workplace that encourages productivity. So thank you for taking the time to listen to me, share a few resources and ideas related to the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are more resources that you can find on our website, the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center on Employer Practices for Individuals with Disabilities, and that's ep.vcurrtc.org. So again, I'm Josh Taylor. Thank you for spending time with me, and have a good day.